Good morning, everyone. You are tuned in to match number 2 of the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2026. Earlier, we saw two teams go up against each other. We saw in proposition Queen's Royal College face off against Wilmer's Boys School, and Queen's Royal College from Trinidad and Tobago were victorious. To see who will be joining them in round 3 of this competition, we have another set of individuals, teams. We have the Queen's College Guyana going up against St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain from Trinidad and Tobago. Good morning again, everyone. I am Ravon Thomas Matthews, and for the purposes of this match, I will be your chair judge. Now, of course, this competition would not have been possible without some really important people. And those are, of course, our sponsors and partners. And so we'd like to take the opportunity to give them a special thank you. So, of course, we want to thank the University of the West Indies, the Center for Reparation Research, the UWI Press, Jade Limited, the University of Hull, and of course, our main partners, the Repair Campaign. Joining me on this panel, I have a series of illustrious guests who I'll ask to introduce themselves, starting with Miss Chantel Hughes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Chantal Hughes. I'll be serving as one of Ravon's wing adjudicators today. Congrats on reaching round 2, and I'm looking forward to some interesting and engaging arguments. Good luck to both teams.
Thank you, Chantel. And of course, Mr. Shavar Campbell.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shavar Campbell. I'll also be a wing adjudicator for this match. And most of the rest of my panel, I'm looking forward to an interesting and clear debate.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, we have for you a special guest judge. Joining us on this panel is Dr. Leslie Gale Atkinson Swaby, a preeminent archaeologist and anthropologist with over 15 years of experience with unique insights into indigenous cultures. And of course, we're so happy to have her on this panel with us. Please introduce yourself, Dr. Atkinson Swaby.
Mabrika, welcome. Well, after that intro, I don't think I need to do much. Thank you for your kind words. It's my honor to be a part of this very special motion. Indigeneity is very ingrained in me, and I'm looking forward to hearing the arguments for and against the motion presented, and I'm sure you all do well. Both Ghana and Trinidad have strong indigenous peoples and cultures, so I'm sure it's going to be quite an exciting debate. Blessings.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atkinson Swaby, and I suspect greatly that it's going to be a wonderful one. The teams who are going to provide such a wonderful debate for us, again, Queen's College Guyana in proposition and St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain, are defending champions in Trinidad, from Trinidad and Tobago. So let us hear from these debaters, starting with, of course, the team in proposition, Queen's College.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Africo Blackman, representing Queen's College today. I will be your first speaker, and
my name is Rafael Joseph. I will be your second speaker this morning.
And my name is David Sugrim, and I'll be the third speaker of the proposition.
Thank you very much. Now, of course, the team in opposition, we invite you to introduce yourself, St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Jordan Fitzpatrick. I'll be your first speaker.
Hi, my name is Jaden Fraser, and I'll be your second speaker.
Hi, my name is Andy Stetson, and I will be the concluding speaker.
Thank you very much. The motion governing this match reads as follows. This House would prioritize internal social reform, such as combating colorism, discrimination against indigenous peoples, distrust in the government, over pursuing reparations from former colonizing states. Once more, this House would prioritize internal social reform over pursuing reparations from former colonizing states. Teams, you already know the format of this debate, but for the benefit of the viewing audience, I will do so nonetheless. So, first speakers, you will have 7 minutes. Second speakers, 6 minutes. And the third speakers, you will have 5 minutes. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which no points of information will be allowed. Outside of protected time, points of information are absolutely allowed and expected. Of course, we have 2 exciting periods of cross-examination for you. I will talk a little bit more about it when we get there. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with all that said, let us get this debate underway. We invite the first speaker from the team in propositions, Africo Blackman, to open this debate.
Firstly, can you hear me properly?
Loud and clear. Ready when you're ready.
I'm starting my debate in 1, 2, 3. Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, esteemed members of the opposition, an attentive audience, today we gather to deliberate on a motion that demands not rhetoric but rigorous thought. This House would prioritize internal social reform, combating colorism, discrimination against indigenous peoples, distrust in government and institutions over pursuing reparations from former colonizing states. Now, we cannot ignore that colonialism plundered economies, imposed inequality, and it undermined governance. That past shapes our history, but not whether progress is possible. The proposition rises in agreement with this motion. And so the real question before us is clear. Can money alone fix systems that are fundamentally broken? Money without reform is motion without direction. Now picture this. It's a bright morning in the Caribbean as history is being made. Flags from various countries flutter while a regional leader steps in front of a grand podium. Cameramen frame the moment, reporters beam, and the headline tomorrow read, "The Caribbean secures reparations at last." But as the confetti settles, a young graduate, brimming with credentials, still can't get a foot in the door due to color-based prejudices that still remain in hiring practices. Members of an indigenous community can't attain historic land rights because of procedural backlogs and outdated policies. Ordinary people from Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica shake their heads at the evening news because the years of public distrust paired with unaddressed discrimination does not stop because of a signed agreement. The check has been delivered, but those mechanisms that govern fairness, opportunity, and trust have been virtually unchanged. This is not transformation. This is what I call confetti economics, festivity without fixing. Allow me to prove why internal reform before reparations is not just practical, but essential. Firstly, institutions drive development and not financial transfers. That is not rhetoric. It is the conclusion of Why Nations Fail in 2012 by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, which shows that inclusive political and economic institutions that enforce contract rights, constrain elites, and broaden opportunity are what produce sustained growth. Let's consider Botswana. In 1996, after independence, Botswana was one of the poorest countries in the world, with GDP per capita among the lowest globally. Infrastructure, it was minimal, and governance systems were fragile. Under the leadership of Sir Seret Sekama, Botswana strengthened institutions before wealth flowed. In the early 1970s, diamonds were discovered in large, high-quality alluvial deposits at the Aropa mine. But most resource discoveries do not lead to prosperity. They lead to what's called the resource curse, where wealth entrenches corruption and rent seeking. But guess what? Botswana avoided that outcome, and not because diamonds existed, but because Botswana's leaders were strengthened institutions first. Botswana did not wait for reparations transfers or reparations from Britain. It strengthened fiscal discipline, built transparent revenue systems, and protected public finance. Across regions, money accelerates, but institutions sustain. Without reform, wealth really and truly is privilege and not prosperity. Therefore, reform must come before reparations. Secondly, legitimacy and social cohesion are prerequisites for national strength. You cannot build strength externally if you haven't built trust internally. For a nation to advance, its citizens must see these institutions as fair, accessible, and accountable. Legitimacy enhances compliance, reduces corruption, and expands civic participation. Take a look at Rwanda. In 1994, Rwanda suffered one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century. Approximately 800,000 people died in 100 days. The social contract, the basis of any society's internal cohesion, was shattered. Hence, under the leadership of President Paul Kagame, anti-corruption institutions were strengthened and administrative structures were reformed and centralized. While Rwanda faces criticism regarding political freedoms, its institutional rebuilding demonstrates the centrality of internal legitimacy. Internal legitimacy is what reconstructed Rwanda. The opposition may attempt to suggest that reparations could bring unity. They will argue that reparations provide moral justice. We respond clearly. Justice delayed by reform is not justice denied. It is justice prepared, because unity is not delivered by checks. Unity is constructed through trust, and trust is built from within. We cannot demand justice externally while tolerating injustice internally. And thirdly, financial inflows without reform worsen inequality and corruption. External funds, when it is not paired with strong governance, can entrench inequalities rather than solving them. Political economics Michael L. Ross, in his seminal 2001 article, Does Oil Hinder Democracy?, published in World Politics, empirically demonstrate that when governments depend on external revenue rather than accountable domestic systems, democratic responsiveness declines and inequality deepens. Now consider Chile. After the 1973 coup and return to democracy by 1990, Chile's institutions were weak and its societies deeply polarized. External financial engagement did not save Chile. Chile institutional reform did. The central bank was made independent. The result, Chile became one of the most stable economies in Latin America. If reparations were to arrive tomorrow without reform, they would risk precisely that: amplification of existing power structures, not equitable advancement. As Jamaican Foreign Prime Minister Kamina Johnson Smith once said, reparations must be grounded in justice, but justice without social and institutional reform is like a house built on sand. It may stand briefly, but it will not endure. Honorable members, we agree that reparative justice is necessary, but without reform, it will not hold. We reject the idea that reparations should take priority over reforms that make reparations effective. Our second speaker will expand on internal reforms further within the Caribbean context. And with that, I thank you all.
And thank you very much. That was Afriko Blackman, the first speaker from Queen's College. Now, to open the debate for the team in opposition, we invite Jordan Fitzpatrick from St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain.
Good morning, everybody. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Good day to the esteemed panel, guests, and opponents. I am Jordan Fitzpatrick, and as the opposition leader, I assert that the opposition emphatically disagrees with the motion that this House would prioritize internal social reforms over pursuing reparation from former colonizing states. Firstly, the current status quo is that social internal reform is viewed as a component of reparations. We will discuss how prioritizing reform over reparations is not only damaging to the population, as it neglects both the psychological health and holistic repair of the effects of colonialism, but also is unsustainable due to ingrained colonial legacies and resource scarcity. Additionally, we will prove how reparations are a catalyst for reform and thus should be prioritized. Before I begin, allow me to rebut some of the points stated by my proposition. Firstly, they claim that progress is further facilitated by reform. However, we can prove that progress is actually inhibited by reform further in my speech. And reparations are more than monetary compensations. They include educational, land reform, land restitution, mental health rehabilitation, and institutional strengthening. To begin, internal social reform only targets certain areas and therefore leaves others neglected. It aims to address specific social injustices through improving laws, structure, and cultural practices. While this is important, it should not be prioritized over pursuing reparations. Firstly, the reparations movement adopts a holistic approach to righting all the wrongs committed against enslaved Africans and indigenous people during colonization and the TCEA. However, internal social reform may only target some of these injustices, leaving other affected areas untreated. In the pursuit of rectifying social injustice, do you really believe it is just to prioritize a goal that would leave the country disadvantaged? Is that not counterproductive to the very goal you aim to achieve? For example, in the 1970s, Michael Norman Manley prioritized internal social reform in Jamaica, aimed at improving literacy, land reform, and subsidized housing. However, in order to fund these reforms, the development of the industrial base was compromised, and there was great economic stagnation, resulting in massive debt. In order to combat this, the IMF was pursued for aid, which resulted in the eventual undoing of all the reform prioritized. Additionally, post-independence, Barbados prioritized its internal stability through reform of its education and healthcare sectors, making it free and accessible for all. However, the government neglected the physical infrastructure of the country, resulting in the eventual breakdown of the water and sewage systems. The CARICOM 10-point plan states that the neglected sectors in the pursuit of reform is not a choice, but a symptom of the persistent harm due to colonialism. Moreover, Sir Hilary Beckles asserts that the failures of the aforementioned internal reform were due to their lack of funding and resources in their efforts to repair crimes that they did not commit. Reparations provides the necessary capital to undertake internal social reform completely and successfully, without neglecting certain sectors that would prove disadvantageous in the future. Additionally, internal social reform is comparable to slapping a band-aid on a festering infected wound. The TTEA resulted in generational trauma and soul wounds that exist in the very essence of every Caribbean person's identity today. Internal social reform treats the symptoms rather than the disease. It is a temporary fix, a quick and easy pill to make you feel better in the moment until the disease rears its ugly head again and produces yet another symptom. How can you possibly say it is better to get rid of one symptom temporarily instead of targeting the actual disease itself? FACO's 2024 paper clearly demonstrates how land dispossession in South Africa is an ongoing structural condition that perpetuates poverty and inequality. Simply implementing internal anti-discrimination policies cannot compensate for the centuries of land dispossession endured by indigenous African peoples. The soul wounds caused by the psychological trauma can only begin to heal through reparations in the form of land restitution. Reform without reparations begins an endless cycle of constantly fighting off symptoms of a real problem, rather than eliminating the problem itself and thus the symptoms along with it. To continue, the internal problems of post-colonial countries, as stated in the motion, all stem from colonialism. Hence, internal social reform without reparations still operates under colonial frameworks and can lead to perpetuation rather than a redress of these issues. For example, the internal social reform undertaken by Cuba during the Cuban Revolution treated racial inequalities towards Afro-Cubans as solely class disparities rather than a structural impediment resulting from the favoring of white and mulatto Cubans during the TTEA. The reform was successful during the time period, creating temporary equality between Afro and white Cubans in areas such as healthcare, housing, and desegregation. However, Castro claimed that the revolution's reform had eradicated racial discrimination. Following this, public discourse about racism was censored, as such discussions were deemed as threats to national unity. As a result, the state disbanded Black independent social clubs such as the Sociedades de Color, claiming they were no longer needed, which inherently stripped Afro-Cubans of their political voice and autonomy. While this internal reform was successful in temporarily improving the socioeconomic status of Afro-Cubans, discriminatory societal norms remained because there were no specific laws or platforms to address them. This was evident at the collapse of the Soviet Union, who was a primary economic sponsor of Cuba in the 1990s. Since reparations were not pursued to strengthen Cuba's pre-existing institutions and dismantle the colonial legacies that uphold racism, these racial hierarchies re-emerged aggressively as a result and still remain prevalent in Cuba today. Therefore, we can see that internal reform alone cannot dismantle colonial legacies that have been ingrained in Caribbean societies and can lead to the illusion that these problems have been fixed, when in reality they continue to persist relentlessly. The opposition stands firm. Reparations must be acquired before sustainable internal reform can be achieved. They provide a change in the status quo by condemning the harmful colonial ideologies of the TTA and facilitating psychological rehabilitation for the generational trauma of colonialism. This allows us to pursue internal social reform free of these ideologies, ensuring that reform is not a mere illusion of progress, but a continuation of developments established by reparations. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was the first speaker from St. Joseph's Convent, Jordan Fitzpatrick. Now, earlier, I would have hinted at an exciting exchange that we dubbed the cross examination. We're going to get into it right now. And so this debate format is going to flow as follows. So there will be 3 questions asked first by the team in opposition, and those 3 questions will be answered by the team in proposition. It's important to note that each question can last no more than 10 seconds, and that only one person on the team who's asking the question can do so at any given point in time. Also important to note, for the team answering the question, you have 45 seconds to do so, and all members of the team can chime in to provide the most comprehensive answer possible, as long as it falls within that 45 seconds. So, after opposition has asked their 3 questions to proposition, we will invite proposition to pose their 3 questions to opposition. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, we invite both teams to unmute their microphones and invite the team in opposition, St. Joseph's Convent, to field their first question to the team in proposition, Queen's College.
Can I begin?
Indeed, ready when you are.
If internal distrust in institutions is a direct result of those institutions being originally designed by colonizers for extraction and exclusion, how can reform work without an external acknowledgement and dismantling of that colonial architecture?
I'm sorry, but can you just please repeat the question one time?
If internal distrust in institutions is a direct result of those institutions being originally designed by colonizers for extraction and exclusion, how can reform work without an external acknowledgement and dismantling of that colonial architecture?
Okay, so as stated in my speech previously, we have internal issues that need to be worked on, that such as corruption, discrimination, and these things, though some may be stemmed from colonial times, it is things that we can fix for ourselves. We should not depend on those on the outside to fix it, because if we can't fix the corruption among us, then we can't expect with the addition of external sources for it to be nullified.
How can a nation realistically prioritize high-cost social reforms like universal education to combat colorism or land restitution for indigenous peoples when its national budget is currently consumed by servicing colonial-era debts to the very states you say we should ignore?
Sorry once again, but can you please repeat the question just to ensure that we're answering it correctly?
No problem. How can a nation realistically prioritize high-cost social reforms like universal education to combat colorism or land restitution for indigenous peoples when its national budget is currently consumed by servicing colonial-era debts to the very states you say we should ignore?
All right, the the funding that comes from financing these various debts and whatnot, what it takes is restructuring of the current budget, things that we have going towards things that we don't need. For example, import bills. If we were to focus more on internal production and focusing on our own cottage industries, then our export bills can be reduced. And not only that, but then we can find the funds now to move around and to invest in these things like education, healthcare, and whatnot for the citizens of the country.
How can the benefits of internal social reform be sustainable and last for generations if they are underfunded due to resource scarcity, resulting in long-term economic and infrastructural consequences as seen in Barbados and Jamaica?
For this question, I'd like to use Guyana as an example, seeing that it's my home country. We have a number of resources with the addition of oil, and with that alone, we've seen a vast growth within our GDP, sorry, our GDP growth, right? And if you take a look at what the country has, there are resources within our very own Caribbean countries. You might have bauxite, banana, different types of production, agriculture, as well as tourism. So if we invest in those industries rather than waiting for those external help, which we do deserve, but we're looking at those internal things that need to be changed. We should focus on the internal social reforms and advancing those industries that are already active.
All right, thank you very much. At this point in time, we extend the opportunity to Queen's College to pose their question to St. Joseph's Convent.
My first question to the opposition. The first speaker mentioned reform emphasizes colonial legacies. Would depending on reparations not also incite a colonial dependency mindset?
The reason why we have this colonial dependency mindset is because of the horrific legacies of colonialism. If you think about it, our economic instability stems from years and years of these countries constantly exploiting us. It's not our fault that we are dependent on these nations. It is just the status quo. And through reparations, it dismantles these legacies, as these countries who perpetuated years of exploitation and racial discrimination can be held accountable and provide the necessary capital that makes reform sustainable and effective.
Okay, and my second question to the opposition. You argue reparations are more than financial compensation. If that is so, wouldn't meaningful reparations require internal institutional reform? Anyways, and if reform is necessary, why should we prioritize fixing our own systems first?
Okay, so we are agreeing with you that reform is necessary. However, we have proven that reform without reparations preceding it's unsustainable because the countries do not have the resources to fully enact it. So therefore, it ends up disadvantaging us in the future, which is counterproductive to the very goal that we are aiming to achieve. So therefore, it is just more economically viable and logical to pursue reparations first so that we do not disadvantage ourselves in the future.
To add, for reform to be effective, it needs to be built on strong foundations. We can't just pursue reform with weak foundations that will lead to it being dismantled and not sustainable for generations. The issues that we are trying to fix are generational.
And the last question, if reparations are meant to address generational trauma, how does receiving external compensation fix ongoing colorism, discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and distrust in institutions that still exist within our society today?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, no problem, no problem. If reparations are meant to address generational trauma, how does receiving external compensation fix ongoing colorism, discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and distrust in institutions that still exist within our society today?
Okay, reparations changes the status quo. It holds people accountable and therefore it opens conversations to discussing why these things were so wrong in the first place. And it allows us to psychologically heal. Furthermore, as seen in Germany's reparations for the Holocaust, it fostered a new generation of Germans who were committed to remembering the horrors of the Holocaust and condemning the action of the Nazi regime. Therefore, it changed the mindset of those Germans, therefore proving that it can also change the mindsets of former colonial countries and people who still have racial discriminations in their heads.
All right. Thank you very much. That was the final question from Team Queen's College. At this point in time, we're going to invite the second speaker from that team, Queen's College, to extend the debate for side proposition. That speaker, of course, being Raphael Joseph.
Just confirming you guys can hear me.
Indeed, ready when you are, Raphael.
3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker, esteemed judges, honorable opposition, and attentive audience. We are gathered here to discuss a matter of grave importance to every Caribbean citizen. That is, whether prioritization of internal social reform over reparations from former colonial powers would prove effective. The proposition's stance is clear. Money alone is like wind in an empty sail. It goes nowhere. I stand before you not to appeal to emotions, but to bring the facts exactly as they are presented, despite how bitter of a pill that may be to swallow. It is no secret that colonialism has done irreparable damage to the Caribbean region, influencing political, economical, and yes, even social structures to this day. We say that these were injustices carried out against our peoples, which is true, no doubt about it. But how are we expected to make effective arguments for reparations when these archaic practices are still in effect today? In his paper, Ethnicity and Elections in the Caribbean, Ralph Premdas would have noted that the ethnic groups of Trinidad and Tobago still view each other with suspicion. He traces this back to the plantation period, where the European planters would have set the Africans and East Indians against each other to maintain their own grasp on the political seat. And I quote, The emancipated Africans developed a contempt for the Indians who had willingly submitted themselves to the degrading regimen of the plantation. Indians, in turn, regarded the Africans as outcasts who had readily accepted and acculturated to the ways of the oppressor. Herein, then, would the first seeds of Indian-African antipathy be born, end quote. This racial hatred would have led to the creation of a plural society, one in which various ethnic groups are comprised, but they lack the social will to integrate or to agree collectively, as posited by J.S. Furnival. But what does this have to do with the contemporary Caribbean, you may ask? Well, according to demographic charts, Trinidadian elections continue to be racially divided, and this phenomenon is not limited to the Twin Islands. Guyana's own 2020 election crisis was a direct result of racial tensions boiling over. PEMDAS further explained this by stating, in a society where interethnic suspicion is widespread and communal identity and power are symbolically interwoven and institutionalized in organized party politics, control of the government has always seen as vital to the survival and well-being of each community, end quote. Now, a question to the audience. If the system of colonialism was as barbaric as we say, why have we as a people not liberated ourselves from its debtor? Furthermore, reparations is the corrections of past wrongs. How can we make an effective argument for its implementation if citizens within the region continue to suffer at the hands of their own countrymen? South Africa has set the precedent for what social reform can accomplish. The system of apartheid would have given way to gross human rights violations against Black South Africans. These atrocities were carried out under legal provisions, a clear example of institutions set in place to protect its citizenry turning against them. In 1994, the system came to an end, rejected, leaving behind a husk of a nation, yet that did not falter them. Under the leadership of Nelson Mandela and the guidance of Desmond Tutu, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed in 1995. Their dual counsel led to the mending of social institutions that were fractured, a constitution being instated, the anti-discrimination laws implemented, and public trust rebuilt from rubble. The Caribbean isn't as far from apartheid South Africa as some may think. Political strife continues to rattle Haiti as heavily armed gangs clash with the National Guard and law enforcement agencies. This is a result of perceived corruption in the upper echelons of power, with instances such as the Petro-Caribbean embezzlement scandal only adding fuel to the fire. Haiti's High Court accused the government of fraudulent mismanagement of funds between 2008 and 2016, resulting in over $2 billion of aid from Venezuela being unaccounted for. Other nations such as Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Suriname also rank very low on the Corruption Perception Index as wage gaps and unaccounted revenue continue to slip through the cracks of bureaucracy. However, it is not too late. If South Africa could accomplish landmark levels of trust in social institutions after apartheid, then what excuse does the Caribbean have? We can make leaps and bounds towards internal reform. The change must start from the inside. Only then can we stand as a united front against our former colonizers and achieve the reparations the region so rightfully deserves. In the words of Michael Manley, the enslavement of the body, which endured till 1838, was nothing to the enslavement of the mind, which persisted since. The Caribbean must rid itself of the mental chains left behind by colonialism. Only then can the changes on international forums be achieved. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was indeed the second speaker from Queen's College, Raphael Joseph. At this point in time, we invite the second speaker from St. Joseph's Convent to extend the debate, and that is, of course, Mr. Jaden Fraser.
Distinguished judges, fellow debaters, and honorable guests. I would first like to begin by rebutting a few of the points made by the proposition. The proposition wants you to believe that distrust in governments and corruption will lead to a mismanagement of funds and reparations. But first, we must discuss the roots of this distrust in Caribbean governments, which stems from colonial authoritarian governance. Corruption in Caribbean governments are deeply intertwined with the institutional, social, and economic structures established during the TCEA. During the TCEA, plantation owners, or the plantocracy, were often also the lawmakers, judges, and administrators of what went on in society. They created and enforced laws that served their own financial interests, which was most likely profit maximization, over the welfare of the majority, which sets a precedent for using public office for private gain, thus proving that the root of corruption stems from injustices and wrongdoings during the TCEA. Secondly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was only partially successful, as it only addressed gross violations such as torture and killing, but not the broader systemic and economic injustices of apartheid. It promoted dialogue, but failed to reconcile the deep ongoing racial and economic divides. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jaden Fraser, and as Deputy Leader of the Opposition, we firmly reject today's motion that internal social reform should be prioritized over pursuing reparations from former colonial states. While issues such as colorism, discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and distrust in government must be addressed, they are rooted in colonial exploitation. Fixing the symptoms before confronting the source is both illogical and unjust. True reform requires accountability and repair from those who created the structural injustices that we face today. The problem of resource scarcity. Internal reform requires massive funding for education, sensitivity training, and judicial overhauls. Caribbean countries cannot reform their way out of a lack of hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. Reparations provide the material base necessary to make social equality possible, especially in the form of financial compensation, debt cancellation, or technology transfer, which provides the necessary resources for developing nations to invest in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Many developing nations face severe economic constraints, making it impossible to fund necessary structural changes on their own. In 1825, France demanded an indemnity of 150 million francs, which was later reduced to 90 million, which in today's economy would be equivalent to 560 million US dollars. The New York Times in 2022 issued an investigation into Haiti's independence debt, which estimated that this extraction cost Haiti billions of dollars in lost revenue over time. Servicing that debt drained public revenue for generations, directly undermining Haiti's ability to invest in infrastructure, education, and governance for over a century, which directly led to the modern ongoing cycle of underdevelopment, alongside political economic instability within the country, worsening government corruption and local distrust. The pursuit of internal social reform without necessary reparations, primarily in the form of financial compensation and debt cancellations, focuses on internal dysfunction rather than structural financial punishment imposed at independence. In an article titled Colonial Legacy and Economic Persistence in the Americas by Richard Montgomery, stated that the institutions, policies, and practices established during the colonial period, such as extractive labor systems, legal frameworks, and centralized administrative control, created enduring patterns of inequality and underdevelopment that continue to shape the economic trajectories of many countries today. This is exactly what is occurring in many Caribbean countries, establishing the economic foundations that are not solid enough to support the effective internal social reform. How can we, in good conscience, tell countries that are still fighting with the economic wreckage of the TCEA and colonial extraction to simply prioritize social reform? How can we ask them to combat discrimination, rebuild trust in institutions, and strengthen governments when they lack the adequate capital to do so? Internal social reform requires resources. It requires funding, institutional capacity, and economic stability, which these countries do not have. To demand that these nations fix deeply rooted social issues without first addressing the roots of the source of their shortcomings, which were caused by historical exploitation, is not only unrealistic, it is unjust. Why should these countries be burdened even more than they already are by having to solve problems that they did not create? Reparations are not a distraction from reform. They are the very tools that make reform possible. Distinguished judges, Are we really going to force the descendants of the enslaved to carry the full weight of a system that they did not design? To prioritize internal reform over reparations is to tell these nations to clean up the damage while the architects of that damage walk away untouched. We, the opposition, refuse that injustice. Reparations are not charity, they are accountability, they are restoration, and without restoration, there can be no real reform. For these reasons, we firmly stand in opposition with today's motion. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Miss Jaden Fraser. Now, we're going to enter into the second period of cross-examination. The rules remain largely the same, except this time we're going to invite proposition to pose their questions first. And so with that, we invite both teams to unmute their mics and invite Queens College, Guyana to pose their first question.
All right. First question. The opposition argues that reparation changes the status quo. How exactly does it change the status quo and mindsets? And what makes social reform unable to do so?
Thank you for your question. To answer this, I would like to reuse the example that we used about Germany's reparations for the Holocaust. These were committed to remembering the horrors of the Holocaust and condemning the actions of the Nazi regime by the mid-1960s. Now, how did this cause a change in the mindset? Let me remind you, this was starkly contrasted to the ideologies prior to reparations, where a 1950 survey displayed that only 29% of Germans believed that Germany owed restitution to Jewish people. So because of these reparations, people who were at first ignorant to the necessity of justice for Jewish people, it changed their mindset and furthered conversations around the need for reparations.
All right, thank you. Second question. Haiti in 2011 would have experienced an earthquake. The UN loaned money which amounted to millions of US dollars. Yet in 2016, 5 years later, only 5 houses were accounted for from said money. How does the opposition address this? Because clearly a large material base was provided, yet social reform did not follow.
Sorry, can you repeat your question, please?
No problem. Haiti in 2011 would have experienced an earthquake which left them devastated. The UN loaned money which amounted to millions of US dollars. Yet in 2016, 5 years later, only 5 houses were accounted for from said money. How does the opposition address this? Clearly there was a large material base, yet no social reform followed.
To answer this question, I would like to say what the purpose of this material base was for. It was to rectify destruction because of the earthquake. These reparations were not fully holistic. They had to be focused solely on fixing infrastructure within Haiti.
All right, thank you. Final question. The opposition argues that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was only a partial success. If even a structured, well-funded reconciliation model produced limited results, what evidence do you have that international reparations would succeed where internal mechanisms struggled?
Sorry, could you just repeat the last part?
No problem. If even a structured, well-funded reconciliation model produced limited results, what evidence do you have that international reparations would succeed where internal mechanisms struggled?
Could you repeat the question one more time, please, just to make sure
We're not
No
understanding.
problem. You argue that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was only a partial success. If even a structured, well-funded reconciliation model produced limited results, what evidence do you have that international reparations would succeed where internal mechanisms failed?
Well, international reparations also have they have a legal framework for it already. from what it sounds to me, you're implying that there is no legal framework for reparations already. We have the Caribbean Reparations Commission already to enact these reparations, and further, we provided examples where reparations have been provided to countries that needed them, such as the examples in Germany.
All right, thank you.
And thank you very much. At this point in time, we invite St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain, to pose their 3 questions to Queen's College, Guyana.
If social internal reform is viewed to have solved domestic issues, can't former colonizers utilize that to reject their obligations of providing reparations?
Just repeat one more time for me. Thank you.
If social internal reform is viewed to have solved domestic issues, can't former colonizers utilize that to reject their obligations of providing reparations?
Well, reparations is non-negotiable. Reparations is the correction of past wrongs. Social reforms in countries, that is what we have done to forward ourselves as a people. Reparations is not something in which we need in order to make changes domestically. We make the changes domestically first, and then we can go to international forums to better argue our point on reparations.
And in better arguing our points as well, when we have internal reform, we could stand together as CARICOM, as the Caribbean on an international level, and stand strong and proud in negotiating to demand our reparations that we need.
How can countries disadvantaged economically by colonial legacies be expected to rectify generational issues without external assistance?
I'm great. I'm actually I'm very thrilled that you brought this up. So I'd like to use the example of Singapore. Singapore is one of the poorest countries in the world. It had no natural resources, but it decided to invest into globalization, industrialization. When you sure that what you cannot just wait around for transfers and these financial aids from these countries. You must take your destiny into your own hands and go out there and better the country. Because if we think about this, if you fall into the mud and wait for someone to take you out, you'll just keep dirty. You get up and take yourself out of that mud and move on. We're not saying that we don't deserve reparations. We do, but we need to focus on those internal problems first.
How do you plan to implement social internal reform to eradicate racial divide without first dismantling the colonial legacies that upheld it?
Please repeat.
How do you plan to implement social internal reform to eradicate racial divides without first dismantling the colonial legacies that upheld it?
Colonial legacies must first be dismantled before. Reparations, as previously stated, is the correction of wrongs. Yet, if we look at South Africa, just after they would have come out of that apartheid period, they created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They did not wait for the persons in the wrong to come out and help them correct it. They, as a nation, would have forwarded themselves, and they would have made the decision to stand together and to right the wrongs committed against them. Reparations would help towards this goal, yes, but we cannot, as a nation, remain crippled, or as a region, remain crippled, waiting for outside assistance while things remain internally that we can fix.
Exactly, we must take steps together. The stuff that we can control, which is our internal prospects, instead of just focusing and waiting on the international body to give reparations.
All right, thank you very much, both teams, for that second period of cross-examination. At this point in time, the debate is going to pause for 1 minute. That 1 minute break will allow the finishing touches to be placed on the reply speeches, after which we will resume the debate with the opposition reply speaker, followed by the proposition reply speaker. With that, ladies and gentlemen, your 1 minute break starts now. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is time ended for your reply speeches. At this point in time, we're going to invite the opposition reply speaker, Annalise Ditson, to close the debate for St. Joseph Convent, Port of Spain.
Okay, I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Good day to the esteemed adjudicators and the proposition. As the opposition reply speaker, I will proceed by reaffirming the opposition arguments in firm disagreement with the motion that this House would prioritize internal social reform over pursuing reparations from former colonizing states. I'd first like to rebut one of the claims made during the proposition's cross-examinations. They compared the Caribbean economy to Singapore. Let us remind everyone that Singapore was a settler colony. The Caribbean was an extractive colony, and we endured generations of chattel enslavement, which disadvantaged us economically, socially, and psychologically. Singapore did not endure these same practices, and we cannot compare these two countries. To begin, I would like to reiterate that the opposition is not condemning internal social reform and has acknowledged that it is vital for the Caribbean to rectify these social injustices. However, due to the erroneous legacies of colonialism, the Caribbean has been left disadvantaged socially, psychologically, and economically, and without first achieving reparations, providing the capital necessary to mend these disparities, true internal social reform can never ensue. Firstly, internal reform without reparations is limited to targeting specific injustices, leaving other domestic inequalities neglected, which weakens the effectiveness of the reform. As seen in Jamaica in the 1970s and in post-independent Barbados, the prioritization of internal social reform improved literacy and access to healthcare, but further imposed economic stagnation, resulting in massive debt in Jamaica, and the neglect of physical infrastructure, resulting in the crash of water and sewage systems in Barbados. Further, the festering psychological trauma as a result of colonialism cannot be combated by changes in domestic policy through internal social reform. For the indigenous African people in South Africa, only reparations in the form of land restitution can initiate healing of the soul wounds imposed by centuries of land dispossession. Moreover, the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice provides a holistic approach to correcting all of the socio-economic injustices from colonialism. Therefore, reparations must be in precedent in order for necessary sectors to not be disadvantaged in the pursuit of social justice. Secondly, the internal problems of Caribbean countries stem from the generational impacts of colonialism. Hence, without first pursuing reparations to dismantle these legacies, internal social reform still operates under these oppressive systems, leading to further propagation rather than redress. In Cuba, the internal reform for racial discrimination was treated as a class disparity rather than a structural issue stemming from the racial hierarchies of the TTEA. While this reform temporarily improved the socio-economic conditions for Afro-Cubans, colonial racial hierarchies were still ingrained in society and reemerged aggressively when Cuba fell into economic instability following the collapse of the Soviet Union. For sustainable eradication of social injustices, there must be a change in status quo, which dismantles harmful legacies, and that is reparations. As seen in Germany's reparations for the Holocaust, they fostered a future of remembrance for the crimes committed, which was in stark contrast to the society prior to reparations, where only 29% of Germans believed that Germany owed restitution to Jewish people. Therefore, reparations will ensure the cancellation of colonial legacies and standards, making social internal reform that promotes progress, not just the mere concept of it. Finally, social internal reform requires proper funding and strong institutions. But due to the highly economic restraints imposed in the Caribbean as a result of the extractive nature, not settler nature, of the Convent of the TTA, those resources can only be made available through reparations in final compensation and debt cancellation. Haiti's 140-year-long servicing of the immense debt imposed by France has resulted in an ongoing cycle of institutional underdevelopment, fueling economic and political instability. How can internal reform be effective if the foundation it is built upon is too economically unstable to support it? In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the opposition is firm. In order for effective internal social reform, the Caribbean must advocate for mandates that solidify the foundations that the reform must operate on. If the foundation is weak, the structure will collapse. Hence, prioritizing the pursuit of reparations strengthens the Caribbean's foundations. And by this proceeding, only then can true social internal reform persist. Mr. Speaker, the opposition rests.
Thank you very much. That was the final speaker from St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain, Annalise Ditson. Now, to conclude the debate for Team Queen's College and to end the debate overall, we invite their third and final speaker, David Sugrim.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Ready when you're ready.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, esteemed members of the opposition and audience. As third speaker for the proposition, I'd first like to unequivocally reinstate my colleague's stance in firm, unwavering agreement with the moot. The House would prioritize social reform, combating colorism, discrimination against Indigenous people, distrust in government and institutions, over pursuing reparations from former colonizing states. As the first speaker stated, institutions, not mere financial transfers, drive real development. Through the practical examples of Botswana, turning diamonds into prosperity through sequence reform, Rwanda, and also Chile. Without social reform, reparations become what the first speaker brilliantly called confetti economics, glittering celebration that leave colorism blocking jobs, Indigenous land rights buried in bureaucracy, and deep distrust in governments untouched. Firstly, I'd like to address what the first speaker of the opposition mentioned a lot, that the proposition is positing reform without reparation. The opposition has failed to prove that reparations should have a greater priority than internal reform. They've also failed to grasp the full scope of the moot. The word prioritize, let me define it for you, opposition. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, it is defined as to decide which of a group of things are more important so that you can deal with them first. The opposition's biggest red flag was the false pretense and assertion that we, the proposition, is advocating for the negation of reparations altogether. Too scared to pursue them, letting colonizers off the hook for centuries of slavery and plundering that still chain us with structural disadvantages. This rhetoric is 100% false and misleading to our stance. The motion urges the use of prioritize, which explicitly means establishing a logic sequence of events, as I priorly stated. Internal social reform first, to build a sturdy mechanism that make reparations transformative, not wasteful. We're not excusing crimes, we are ensuring justice lands effectively. Look at the IMF's 2025 Caribbean Regional Economic Outlook. Institutional quality outperforms financial transfers every time in sustainable growth. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, while we must recognize and honor the Caribbean's tainted colonial history, we must more so take all the steps necessary to break from it. Internal reform makes reparations truly effective. Another point that the first speaker mentioned was leaning on moral imperatives and the psychological effects that reparations has had on us, insisting that reparations must come immediately as an atonement and that reform is some well-calculated delay tactic. But morals without practical machinery are meaningless performative gestures. It evaporates. The opposition fails to recognize that true justice, as the Jamaican foreign minister warned, demands social and institutional reform as the foundation, or it crumbles like a house on sand. Reparations into fractured systems don't erase our distrust in systems, they amplify it. As Michael Ross's seminar work shows, external rents erodes accountability and deepens inequality. We, the proposition, by contrast, zeroes in on the motion's exact prescriptions. Robust fair hiring laws to combat colorism, streamlined policies and recognition processes to end discrimination, indigenous discrimination, and transparent accountability mechanisms to rebuild faith in our government. The opposition stance on reparations now or never. Urgency skips the blueprint that guarantees failure. Another point brought up by the opposition is that we don't have the economics and we don't have the money that would fuel reforms. This myth crumbles under regional evidence. The IMF's 2025 Overlook for the Caribbean explicitly states that rule of law and capacity and accountability predicts sustainable growth far better than one-off transfers. Without them, reparations risk Haiti's fate, where the post-independence reparation debt shifted its development for over a century. Moreover, the opposition claims that internal reform demands massive capital that only the colonizers can provide. First, this is a fear-driven fantasy. Reform precedes and attracts sustainable investment. According to the IMF 2025 Overlook again, it shows that strong institutions draw foreign direct investments far better than a begging bowl. We sequence reform first to unlock owed funds effectively, not leaving money on the table, but ensures it reaches the colorism victims and indigenous communities and distrustful citizens. Our dependency trap keeps us chained. Only internal reform can take us out. So, because of the opposition's flawed stance, you've heard me say the word fail a lot. But I conclude to the House, let us not fail in recognizing that internal reform is in fact a prerequisite and must be prioritized over pursuing reparations from former colonial states. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was David Segrim, the final speaker for this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, the judges have some work to do. We're going to excuse ourselves to another space and return to you promptly with the results of this match as well as some feedback for the teams. See you in a bit.
As Queens College students, we firmly believe that reparations are a way to honor our ancestors' suffering.
Caribbean societies that have emerged from the roots of colonialism and slavery continue to experience generational poverty, even as the region moves towards development.
But why do we even need reparations today? You see, the fact of the matter is, the injustices of imperialism still mold and shape society today.
We believe that the movement for reparations is essential towards the full dismantlement of the colonial mindset that many of us still hold in current times.
So, let us not be chained by the weight of our past any longer. Instead, let us start to make strides towards the changes that the Caribbean actually needs.
Hi, I am Andy Sisson and I am the team captain.
I'm Jordan Fitzpatrick.
I'm Angelina Bihari.
I'm Jadon Fraser.
And we are from St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain.
Firstly, systematic racism and prejudice towards the use of Creole and other indigenous languages are a direct result of colonialism.
Furthermore, the genocide of indigenous people has almost completely eradicated all aspects of their culture and left them the most marginalized group in the Caribbean.
Hence, Europe should provide reparations for the problems that they created in the first place.
The injustices faced by the enslaved do not just end in the history books or documentaries, but they live within the poverty these communities inherit, the opportunities they never receive, and the trauma that they still carry.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this International Reparation Debate Competition. This International Reparation Debate Competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparations so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Ekiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of a people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All criticals observe, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The burdens. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo. The history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Maroons, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also and syllabi that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring 2 substantive. 1, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And 2, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm, and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency, and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience, and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching hard history can be both emotionally and safe, intellectually enriching. According to a 2021 RAN Corporation study, students in these programs which is a reform program by the way, show that 94% increase in civic agency, meaning they felt more empowered to take social action and reported deeper empathy, stronger historical understanding, and more open-minded attitude. And the fact that we're seeing seeing this in real classroom, Mr. Speaker, proves that harm is not inherent to the topic. It's about how we design the curriculum and support teachers. And we are currently doing this now through reform. If we have models that work, and we do, then the moral burden shifts to improving delivery, not erasing the content. What my third warrant is suppressing this history causes more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, be aware that we're not talking just about the current history. We're talking about the teaching of the history overall, because that's what the mood says. In environments where slavery is ignored or downplayed, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Students grow up believing that slavery was minor, that racism is just a mere relic of the past, or that systemic inequality is simply an overreaction. This ignorance sustains real-world harm, and contrary to this, we're seeing that countries like Germany, who have faced their history head-on with regards to the Holocaust, show lower levels of historical denialism and far-right extremism than those that whitewash. The impact, it promotes social equity and activism, because when students learn this history accurately and empathetically, they become more socially aware, engaged, and ready to challenge injustice. And two, it empowers empathetic, informed citizens who are empowered to fight modern injustice. And three, it protects future generations from repeating injustice itself. My second substantive is silence enables racism to thrive. My first warrant is when schools avoid teaching slavery, they leave students with distorted or incomplete narratives. In the absence of formal education, when students are left to piece together understanding from biased media, peer opinions, or online misinformation, the result is a deeply distorted view of race and history. A 2018 SPLC report showed that only 8% of the US high school seniors could identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. When students believe that slavery was a voluntary arrangement or that racism ended in 1865, it undermines every effort to promote justice and equality today. Silence gives racism plausible deniability that it suggests falsely that if we don't talk about injustice, it must not exist. The impact, it ensures future generations. And with that, the proposition momentarily rests.
400 years ago, 400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what will be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice, rape and disgrace, blood rains, brute, force, ignorance, hate in their veins. Sweat and tears, labor revealed, produce from king fields only for the esteemed. 400 years of eroding one's pride, culture, heritage, value. 400 years of the iron chain, stringing up, leaving bare. Oh, but they never cared. Why fight when you would be met with sharp blades? So don't you dare cry out in fear. Why not plan an escape with the plaiting of one's hair? Oh, the drums, listen, dance, communicate. For tonight we fight a battle not even death could spare. Blue eyes, white skin, master said that's beauty within. But guess what? Black, brown, gold, royalty, reparations, we are owed. Them say hassa, but we say cassava. That's where we get the strength from to beat and conquer. For tonight, we're returning to Ghana. You may say, I'm a descendant of slaves because of the rich melanin that gushes from my pores. But I came to tell you tonight, I am not a slave. Rather the descendant of kings and queens. I am the embodiment of the divine. I do not chase, I align, I attract. What's meant for me already has my name on it. I am the personification of beauty, the expression of love, the creator of life, the acknowledgement of freedom. So go ahead, call me what you want, because when I die, bury me in the oceans where my ancestors jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage.
This is something that I wanted to discuss since Emancipation Day, but did you know that Britain only finished paying for slavery in 2015? Yes, 2015 as in 10 years ago. This fact was revealed in a since deleted tweet back on February 9, 2018 by the then Her Majesty's Treasury. In 1833, Britain borrowed 40% of its national budget, £20 million, to finance the Slavery Abolition Act. This act was the official end of British slavery and went into effect on August 1st, 1834. The money that was borrowed was used to repay British slave masters for their quote-unquote loss of property. However, for the enslaved, there was no repayment and no form of compensation was offered. The amount that was borrowed, the £20 million, was equal to £2.2 billion in today's money. The since deleted tweet from Her Majesty's Treasury pointed out that the taxes paid by people today was used to repay the loan that paid the slave masters. This would mean that people from the Windrush generation and their descendants, people from Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and other British colonies, would have helped to repay the loan taken out to pay the people who enslaved their ancestors. Using this video, I want to highlight that when people say that slavery was so long ago, 400 years ago, ancient history, and we should get over it, we can see that it wasn't that long ago. If we look at a timeline of the history of Barbados, we can see that chattel slavery in Barbados lasted 207 years, whereas the time from emancipation in 1834 to today is only 191 years. So as a nation, we spent longer in slavery than we've spent free. I want you to think about that. Facts like these are why people have started a call for reparations, to correct an injustice done to us as a nation, a region, and a people. If you want to learn more about reparations and how you can be involved, click the link in my bio.
What you take, give it back. Stolen riches, give it back. My name, you changed that. Your hate, keep that. My land, where's that? Green pastures now flat. Your greed did that. My religion, you stopped that.
The African emancipation experience is a story of resistance and breakthrough, so that I could stand before you and speak to you because my ancestors paid the price for me. So when you look at me, see not just African beauty, but freedom in its entirety, where black is beautiful and freedom is opportunity, where people who look like me can be celebrated equally. Don't be distracted by my melanin. This skin that was once frowned upon is now flourishing. And if you know not to which I am speaking, then let the history lesson begin. To understand where we're going, we must first understand where we come from. So for some, this story begins at the bottom of a ship, forcefully migrated from the motherland as human cargo, an economical decision to work on a sugar plantation, and so slavery began. Beaten mercilessly, and regardless of sex, they were all treated as property. Can you imagine what it would be like to not be in control of oneself, to have your very life determined by somebody else? And if you want to talk about human rights violations, slavery is the definition. Punishment, imprisonment, torture, mutilation, sold without hesitation, separated from tribes to limit communication, and if you even harm an African ritual master could have your tongue for that. So on the plantation, it had none of that. We did what we were told, no questions asked. After all, slavery was an organized business and we were just labor. To work without receiving a dollar, branded and assigned Christian names didn't make it any better. But I am the prayers of my ancestors answered. A strong black African woman whose voice has the power to command even the boldest man, whose power comes from purpose, whose pain has inspired passion. So every African descendant walking confident continues to break the chains of a cycle. On August 1st, 1838, my generation was molded in hope, paid for in sacrifice, bought in tears. So when these heirs hear the words African emancipation, can we understand the dedication of our ancestors' contribution to civilization? Because these doorways to freedom that we walk through so gracefully was paid for with the life of your mummy's mummy. So I wear my African heritage proudly, as this poem speaks to who we are, who we were, and who we will be. And since I get to decide, I will take my African emancipation walk in stride. Stand with me, side by side. Black woman to black man, black boys to black girls. Let our stories be told with honor. Let the skin be celebrated in boldness. For in the end, this story was always destined for greatness. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparation so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There's none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper.
All right,
But
ready,
inside, the lesson
everyone?
lingers that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher.
So sorry, one of our members.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, the judges are back and we have with us the decision for this match. So the motion before us read, this House would prioritize internal social reform over pursuing reparations from former colonizing states. So what did we hear in this debate? Well, both teams concluded that internal reform is a super important thing. Internal social reform is important. It also seemed to the judges that both teams concluded that reparations is something that is going to happen. It's just a matter of when. So now here's where the debate becomes a little less mutually exclusive, and we had to really do a lot of work to parse it out. If both teams believe that internal social reform is important, which fair enough, the question then becomes a matter of prioritizing one or the other. We think that David Segrim, you did a really good job of pointing that out, the importance of the prioritization of the motion and really centering that motion and showing what we should really be here debating, right? The prioritization. So given that, it seems as far as the judges could have concluded that Queen's College largely concedes to the fact that reparation is something that is going to happen. Like, there's no uncertainty about it. It's just an eventuality. Then we are left weighing the question then. What happens if we get that reparation now, or in the near future, and the systems that are in place right now just aren't enough to manage that fund? And they tell us that they're not. They tell us, for example, that what happened with Haiti, even though it's not necessarily a matter of reparation, the principle behind what happened with Haiti, Queen's College tells us, is that the United Nations gave Haiti, a country that had poor internal social structures, a bunch of money to deal with a particular situation. And because of the weakness of those internal structures, the money was not utilized in a way that it should have been utilized. And that this is likely going to happen to other countries who simply don't have the internal structures, internal social structures that exist. So even if the money wasn't for reparations, the principle, Team Queen's College says, still stands. However, on the other side, St. Joseph's Convent tells us, well, we need the money in order to drive the change. And so the debate became kind of circular, right? So Queens tells us that we need internal reform to steward the reparations money. But St. Joseph tells us that we need the reparations money to fix the internal social reforms. And so the debate was particularly circuitous in that particular manner. And the judges really wanted some more parsing out of that. We didn't want to be in that infinite loop. We wanted to understand how we broke that loop, right? And so we want to point out that to both teams. So we got a lot of examples, for example, especially from Africa. Africa told us about Botswana and how Botswana got a lot of resources, right? Similar to what we would get from reparations. But what's actually going to what happened with Botswana is that they had fiscal discipline and they strengthened their institutions. And even though they were victims to a lot of similar harms that we were victim to in the Caribbean region, because of their fiscal discipline, Africa tells us, Botswana was able to get over that resource curse that we see plague so many other instances. We see examples of well in Chile. And so that was the justification from Queen's College to a large extent, right? We also heard that there were racial tensions and that we need internal reform to solve for those racial tensions. St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain, tells us, on the other hand, that internal structural reform that exists just by its own don't work. And they pointed out what happened with Cuba, where Fidel Castro just declared that racism has ended, therefore racism has ended, and anybody who spoke otherwise was going to be going to face some bad outcomes. In fact, the institutions that existed, we heard, particularly from Jordan, we just were told that they no longer need to exist because the problem was solved. And that is indicative, Jordan says, of the fact that internal social reform just by its own just isn't enough. A large part of the case from St. Joseph's tells us that if the problems were caused by enslavement and all of the extraction of being an extraction colony and all the horrible things that happened to us, then we need reparation to solve it. That's an interesting claim. We wanted to understand a little bit more, St. Joseph's. Why is it so important that we use reparations to fix these problems in particular, if Queen's College tells us that it can be fixed? Of course, this is in the context, of course, of St. Joseph's telling Queens that we don't have the money to fix the internal social reform. And Queens tells us that, well, we'll find the money. We'll allocate the budgets, we'll do what needs to be done. A general principle of debating is that if the motion supposes that two ideas are going to be contended, the motion supposes that either can be done. And so it wasn't the strongest line of argumentation to say, well, we don't have the money to do it, because if we didn't have the money to do it, then the debate couldn't have been had. So the motion supposes that both things can happen. And so St. Joseph's, because a lot of your analysis was centered around the fiscal improbability of this thing happening, you wouldn't have been spending your time the best right there, because in order for the debate to be had, it needs to be said that this is something that can be had. And so while Queen's response to how it is we're going to fund it might seem frivolous, it's a response that is as much as needed, given that they have the fiat to allow for this particular thing to be done in the first place, right? And so, ladies and gentlemen, after a lot of deliberation and going back and forth, the judges have returned. It's important to note that this was not a unanimous decision. There were dissenting judges on the panel, but the majority of the panel concluded that the team that won this match on 276 points to their opponents 272 is the team in Proposition Queen's College. Congratulations, Queen's College. Well played, St. Joseph's Convent. We invite both teams to unmute their mics in the spirit of sportsmanship.
Congrats. Yeah, congratulations. Yes, thank you so much. I would like to congratulate everyone that made this debate possible, to give us an opportunity to speak on this very motion. We're very excited for it, and we're political enthusiasts. So it has been amazing. Thank you for the opportunity, and I wish everyone good luck in their future endeavors. To the other team, you are formidable opponents, and thank you for such a great debate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Wonderful. Once more, the winners of this match, Queen's College with an automatic advancement. St. Joseph's Convent will be waiting to see if they will be securing one of very few wildcard slots. The best debater from this match actually comes to us from the winning team, and that is the reply speaker from Queen's College, David Segrim. David, you did an excellent job, we believe, in pointing out where this debate should have been and in summarizing the clashes. Congratulations. Ladies and gentlemen, join us in a few minutes where we will see match number 3, where Herbert Morrison Technical High School will face off against Merrill Grove High School. The motion: this house believes that social media activism does more harm than good for the reparation movement. Until then, have a lovely rest of your day.